Okay, I think we are live. Let's wait a minute to get some people to jump in the chat. Yup, we are live. Welcome. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining our 26th Sochology Eduseries. My name is Hassan Zia, and today we are super excited for our special guest for you. But before we get started, just some quick announcements and housekeeping. Soch cafes will be happening in Lahore, Karachi, and Islamabad for the month of November. Soch cafes are in-person product manager meetups for where PMs can connect, discuss a topic, exchange ideas and experiences. It's also a fantastic way to network. So visit our LinkedIn page and start following if you haven't already. Look out for posts about Soch cafes happening in your city so you can know where and when the next ones are scheduled, and also to be updated on our other event streams. Coming back to this session, whether you're joining us from LinkedIn or YouTube, please post your questions in the chat and we'll bring them up towards the end of the session. Our guest for today is Ant Murphy. With over a decade of working in product, Ant has worked across small startups to large enterprises and firmly believes that the secret to great products is building great product teams. Today, Ant is a product coach and founder of Product Pathways and has a client list that spans several industries from fintech to AI. He has coached founders, product managers, leaders across the globe from companies such as Miro and Stack Overflow. Ant is a regular keynote speaker. He hosts a YouTube channel as well as a bi weekly newsletter that is read by the thousands. In this talk, Ant will explain the role that product strategy plays in prioritization, distilling prioritization down into simple and manageable activity that you can start applying tomorrow. And thank you so much for making the time to join us. And over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah, cool. We'll go through the slides, talk a little bit about this. Maybe the title of all of this gives it away a little bit, but I think this is just a really important topic, and I'll explain why in a minute. So I'm super fortunate, and thanks for the amazing intro. And as a product coach, I get to work with lots of different companies. I get to coach individual product managers and leaders from all corners of the world, and I get to see common patterns and common complaints. And one of those common complaints and patterns is prioritization, in particular around it being difficult. And I hear things like we should really struggle with prioritization here. Prioritization is really hard. All those types of things, right? And when you start to peel back why that's the case, often they've been given this type of advice, and I was given this advice when I was first in my first product role, and it was basically like prioritize based on value. And at face value, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, value, that's what we need to prioritize on. But what do we mean by value? In fact, it's a pretty ambiguous word that we use all the time. And it's pretty ironic as well, because as product people, our job is to maximize value, yet we often have a very hard time defining what value is. And I find that this is not really a helpful thing. And definitely, I resent the advice that I got given all the way back then. So when you start to unpack it, what do we mean by value? You could ask different people, they'll give you different answers. They'll say things like business value or customer value, or it's about risk or delight or, customer experience, those types of things. And when we don't have a good grasp of value and we struggle with prioritization, we tend to try to solve it in different ways. One of them, which is one of the most common, is what I like to call spreadsheet prioritization. And I hope I don't call anybody out in this, but we often then create these complex formulas. We create these big spreadsheets. We input all these numbers, and we hope that it's going to give us some magical priority score out the other end, and that's going to help us prioritize. The other thing that we tend to do too that I observe is maybe we defer prioritization, right? Or we give it to somebody else. We say, well, actually the founders need to prioritize this, or we can't make that call. And we essentially, escalate everything up. Well, somebody else needs to do it, or my boss needs to sort it out, or those types of things. I call this the blessing game because essentially everything on the backlog needs to go via some person who needs to bless it and, anoint that idea and say that we can continue with it, right? But all these things are really just symptoms to a deeper problem, is really my observation of it. And when you peel it back, what you tend to find, and what I tend to find, is that they're trying to prioritize down here. This is a kind of a fundamental problem. And I hope I can reframe how you think about prioritization in the next 20 odd minutes. They're trying to prioritize down here. So what they're ending up with is this big roadmap and this big backlog of all these ideas, and potentially it's hundreds of ideas long, because really there's no shortage of great ideas, and we're trying to prioritize that, and that becomes really difficult. And this is often happening because the middle layer and strategy is often missing. I tend to find most places have a vision. Most places, at least, whether it's explicit or not, written down or not, they have a good grasp of the vision and where they're trying to head. What they often don't have is that middle piece. And I'm not going to try and say it better, because I think John Cutler said it best. Without a strategy, all you're left with is a whole bunch of good ideas and no way to actually prioritize them. And I see this time and time again. And when places struggle with prioritization and they have things like spreadsheet, prioritization, mind you, I don't have anything completely wrong with it. It's only when it's, your entire prioritization or strategy, right? All these things tend to be symptoms of a deeper problem, not necessarily the problem itself, right? And it's because their strategy is either vague, or it's lacking, or it's missing. And a lot of this has got to do with how we think about product work and how we think about prioritizing work. And the two things of prioritization and strategy aren't mutually exclusive. So if you're missing one, you're going to have a hard time doing the other. And if you have one, it's going to make the rest of it a lot easier. So if we go back to that triangle that I had before, really, if you think about it, if you think about value, how do we define value? Well, value is actually defined from the top and all the way down. And so is prioritization. Prioritization is actually not this kind of single activity that happens in a linear fashion or on a linear backlog or something like that. It's actually something that happens continuous, and it happens in multiple different layers. In fact, when we're trying to set a product vision, we're actually making prioritization decisions there. Like, what do we want the vision to be? What do we not want to be? And that's also strategy choices, and so on and so forth. What I want to do is make this a little bit more tangible to you and give you some actionable steps and really just break it down. So if we take this picture and we make it into something else, what we need to do is we need to start here. So we need to start with a vision, and we need to start with our strategy. Now, most places don't have a strategy because they're not really sure of what a strategy is. So, to make it really simple, a strategy is a set of choices. These are choices to do something, to be something, to target a certain customer market, to price in a certain way, to not have sales and do product-led growth, or whatever choices you need to make, right? And this is something that makes strategy a little bit more vague and a little bit more difficult to grasp, but that's really the crux of it. It is a set of choices. And if you think about product strategy, these are choices to, position your product in a certain way, to have certain flywheels or no flywheels, a moat or no moats, all those types of things. And every single time we make a choice to do something, we're also making a choice to not do something. So if we're targeting a certain customer, we're also not targeting someone else. And sometimes the latter part is actually more important than what we're actually targeting. So that's also probably another interesting thing. To make this a little bit more tangible to you and start to illustrate how this makes prioritization easier, I was listening to the Diary of the CEO podcast the other day, and Rory Sutherland was on it, marketing extraordinaire. He's got a great book called Alchemy. Great book on marketing if anyone's interested. But they went on a side tangent, and Steve, the host, was actually sharing a story about a health food company that he actually invests in. I believe he's on the board of, and he was actually in the room when this kind of happened. And they were basically presenting a new chocolate bar. So they made, I believe it was a chocolate bar. They make like healthy chocolate bars. And it was a new formula, a new chocolate bar that was essentially going to taste as good as pretty much any other unhealthy, run of the mill chocolate bar that's out there. However, in order to get the flavor that they had achieved, to make it taste basically like a normal chocolate bar, they actually had to make a small compromise to the health properties of that bar. And apparently, they had a very long discussion about it. And ultimately, they decided in the end that they were not going to proceed with that chocolate bar, that they were not going to, they were not willing to make any compromises on health for flavor or any other aspect for that matter. And this is strategy. These are choices. They don't want to be the best tasting, chocolate bar company. They want to be the healthiest chocolate bar company. And that choice makes that prioritization decision a lot easier. Do we do this or do we not do that? Because it's a great idea. It's a great idea to make chocolates taste really great. And maybe we're going to sell a whole bunch because of that, even though they're much healthier alternatives. But ultimately, because of their strategy, they chose not to do that, and they chose not to basically prioritize that. So once we have a strategy, once we have a set of choices, we've defined that. There's some templates out there. I've got even some myself on Product Pathways, but my perspective on the templates is use it as a starting point. The choices that you need to make are going to be contextual to your product and your space alone, so you'll have to evolve it. But there's some pretty basic things that you need to put in there, like who and why and what. But once we have that, we then need to start to turn it into measurable outcomes. And why do we want to do this? Well, because our strategy is generally multiple years long, or at least 1 year long. So it's a very large time horizon. We want to start to break that down and start to model it into milestones that we can measure, and we can look at progress of that strategy. So once we do that, we start to define these as outcomes, often in the shape of OKRs if you use OKRs, but really we want to turn it into measurable milestones. And when we start to do this, we can start to prioritize again, right? How do we actually, take this strategy? What strategic levers do we want to pull in order to take those first steps towards our strategy, which is the steps towards our vision? And I'll illustrate this in a second. So there's a mistake here, which is to do this, to basically have that strategy, then to, create a whole bunch of, work. What is all the work we need to do? Plot it all down and start to execute on it. What we end up doing is we end up creating these really big items of work, and we start to work towards them. But what we really should be doing is actually taking the outcome and actually making the outcome smaller. This is something that, great product teams really practice really well, and I don't see enough. So illustrate it with a very crude example. Let's say that we know we need to increase our annual recurring revenue for whatever reason, right? It's part of our strategy. We know we need to do that. We know we need to hit certain targets for whatever reasons. I said it was a crude example. Now, there's many different lever points that we can do in order to achieve that, right? Like we could support higher costs, we could acquire more customers, we can move into new markets, we could decrease churn, we could increase conversion, we could look at like costs and how can we redirect costs into other things. There's multiple different lever points you have to do there. Strategy, again, comes into the picture because the question becomes, well, which lever points do we actually pull? And we need to prioritize these outcomes by actually deciding, well, which one do we do first? Because maybe we want to do multiple of them, but which one are we going to do first? And then once we've even got that, so let's say hypothetically, we want to increase conversion. We actually even want to make that even smaller. Because if you look at the conversion rate or increasing conversion across an entire conversion funnel, that could be potentially a lot of different things that we can do. There's still a pretty broad spectrum of things we can do. It's still a smaller spectrum than just increase revenue, but it's still a broad spectrum. We can make that even smaller. We can start to say, well, could we increase conversion at this step? Could we increase click-through rate at this step or this part of a form? We could start to say, well, could we just improve the experience or, remove more fields? Because if we can improve the experience, we believe we can have, more click-throughs, which means we have more conversion. And what we're doing is we're really making the problem really, really small. And, potentially we're looking at the entire conversion funnel and we're saying, well, what part of this funnel is the worst? And how do we just start there? And then the number of things that we can do that align to that outcome become a lot less. And this is kind of the magical part of it, right? So rather than trying to prioritize 100 different, opportunities to increase conversion. We're just looking at this part of the funnel, which starts to filter them out. Which kind of brings you into the next step, which is then once we have those outcomes, we need to start to look at, well, what opportunities actually align to that? Because again, there's a whole list of great ideas, but we need to find that intersect between what we want to achieve as an organization and our strategy and those types of things, as well as what customer problems and needs exist. And again, when we do that, we can immediately start to filter things out. There's going to be a bunch of opportunities that don't align. And, again, we're not even like prioritization is almost being done for you because we're just deleting those things or ignoring them for now because it doesn't align to the current incremental step that we're making. And then when we start to do this really, really well as well, this can be really powerful. So to give an example, I did some work with a FinTech quite recently, a couple of years ago. And one of the things that they were doing, so their strategy was focused on growing home loans. For any of you who haven't worked in the banking space, home loans is very strategic for banks because it's one of the biggest financial decisions that we make in our lives as consumers. And when we actually take out a home loan, we often move all of our bank accounts and everything across as well. So it's quite a very powerful lever point in order to basically win market share and proliferate to other products across the business. So they were really hyper focused on that. And I was doing some work with the home loans team, and we had this as our outcome and our OKR, and we started to look at customer opportunities that exist underneath this. We started talking to customers, doing discovery, all the great work that we normally do. And one of the things we uncovered was that auctions are a big thing here in Australia because the property market's crazy, but people were missing out on getting their homes and going to auction because turnaround times were just too slow. If it was a Wednesday or even Monday or Tuesday in the week, and you saw a house that you really loved, and the auction was that Sunday, because they're typically on Sundays, there was just no hope that you were going to get approval from any bank just a couple of years ago in time. So we saw this as an opportunity that we could basically, an underserved part of the market, that if we could actually do something here, we could actually then still and captivate that market. And I'm sharing this story because this is a really important piece of the puzzle, because what we're prioritizing here is not to just make the application simpler and quicker and faster. We're actually prioritizing this opportunity, which is we want to help people actually get their dream home and be able to go to auction. And this is a crucial difference because when you start to tackle that problem, people become less price sensitive because you're the only provider that does it potentially. People become less price sensitive. They start to come to you, all those types of things. So that's a very different problem to be solving than just how do we make this simpler and easier? And the other thing that then does, as a side note, is that when we get into go-to-market activities and everything, we become very laser focused on what we're actually solving. We're not talking about fastest approval time. We're actually saying make it to the auction on time, right? Get approval before the auction, those types of things. So we can be very laser focused in that targeting. So once we have all that, we then get down to the final bottom, which is a whole bunch of ideas and solutions in order to solve that. And the powerful thing here too is rather than trying to prioritize that 100 odd ideas, we're actually potentially only looking at 2 or 3 solutions to that one opportunity. And that is a lot more manageable than trying to prioritize, hundreds of ideas. And if you think about how this all works, is we're basically prioritizing and going down through the layers. And as we go down through the layers, we're saying no to things, we're saying yes to certain things, and that basically keeps it all manageable. It's easier to make a handful of choices in terms of your strategy. And then it's easier to prioritize, between 5 different outcomes that we can potentially have. And then it's easy to prioritize the 6 opportunities that fit underneath that outcome. And then the 2 or 3 solutions that fit underneath that opportunity, as opposed to trying to prioritize the 100 odd ideas and opportunities we have. So prioritization is really a multi-layered activity. And, people often attribute this quote to Einstein, which was, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and then 5 minutes thinking about solutions. I think you can really think about prioritization and strategy in this way. I want you to spend 55 minutes up here, focusing on the vision and the strategy and the outcomes and the opportunities, and only 5 minutes down there. That is going to make prioritization way easier. Anytime you're down the bottom in the solution thing, start to work back up the chain and start to spend more time there defining those things, and then get back down and see if it's still relevant. And if you take anything away from the 20 odd minutes I've spoken, it's this: prioritization shouldn't be hard. My experience is we only make it hard because we skip all of those critical steps and we jump straight to the bottom and try to prioritize this big long list of ideas, this big roadmap of features and backlog items, as opposed to actually working on the strategy and working your way through the stack. And that's it. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you for your time. That was really insightful. And I think making the connection between prioritizing and strategy, it certainly would make the things easier in while stakeholder management. Okay, so we have a question from Amin. He's asking, prioritizing for outcomes that align with strategy often need buy-in from stakeholders. What's the best way to do that?
Yeah. So the two things go hand in hand: strategy and those outcomes. Ideally, you should be getting your stakeholders to buy into the strategy too. So if they buy into the strategy, when you start to define those outcomes, it becomes easier because you're like, hey, remember that the strategy is this, and these are the choices we're making. Therefore, this outcome is really important. The other ways to create buy-in, in my experience, and I ran a strategy workshop with a product team this morning, so this is actually really timely because I actually mentioned some of these things to them. If you put a good amount of thought and detail into your strategy, and what I mean by that is like context. Context is so important in strategy, and it's often missing in strategies. So if you put a good amount of context, as in, this is what's happening in the market, this is what's happening in our business, here's what's happening with our current products and our current customers, and because of all of these data points, these are the choices that I think we should make and why we should make them. That is going to build a much more compelling argument and will be able to generate buy-in because you've got good rationale and good reasoning and good data to support why you think you should do something. The second thing I'll just add on to that is to actually just involve them in the process. We often don't want to because we get worried the stakeholder is going to derail things and try to take control over it. That might be the case, but you can try to manage that. I think it's always better to involve them. When you don't involve them and you just go and do it in a black box and go, ta-da, here's the strategy, that's often, they tend to freak out. And then, yeah, that's when friction occurs because they're like, what's this? I haven't heard this. I haven't seen this before. So the more you can involve them in the process, the better.
That makes sense. We have a couple more questions as well. This one is from Roy. He's asking, first of all, he's thanking you for great advice. And then, how can we prevent engineers from jumping into the solution first? I am guilty.
This is definitely, I don't think so. I ended up reframing my perspective on this several years ago. I worked with a brilliant design lead, and he said it to me. He said, it's actually human nature to jump to solutions first. He was like, I think we get it wrong by saying focus on the problem, don't focus on the solution, because like we, especially depending on your mindset, like some people are just more geared that way, and what you end up doing is actually fighting against their their own nature and their own mind, and you're not going to win trying to fight that, right? So his advice was to go with it, and I've just since deployed this advice for many years now, and it works very well. So the way that I approach this is not to stop them from going to solutions first, is to just let it happen. Okay, you think that's a great idea. What's your idea? And then to either work backwards from there or to work forwards from there. Sometimes forward can be easier, and I'll explain forward because most people know what working backwards is. So working forwards is like, okay, if we were to build that thing, whatever it is, that integration or that API or whatever it is, what would that mean for our customers, right? So what you're doing is you're just projecting into the future. If it existed, what would that mean? So, and then they'll say something like, "Oh, that means we could, sell it, or we could charge for it, or something like that." Okay, well, who do you think is buying this? If we're, or who are we trying to sell it to? Oh, I think these people would really value it. Okay, and what you're doing is you're actually starting to unpack the problem by working forwards into the future. And I think it's a very powerful technique, and that's the way I generally approach this. And then over time, they can start to build the muscle and start to catch themselves and say, "Okay, that's a solution." And I'm going to just park it there and mention it, but then I'm going to try and work backwards myself. But I think it's generally, my experience has always been to just work with them. Okay, great idea. Why do you think this is a great idea? If we did build it, who are we building it for, and what problem? Like, why? What would it enable them to do? And if they could do that, what does that mean for the business? And you actually start to unpack that thinking, and then you're like, okay, so that's the problem, and that's what we're trying to solve. Okay, great. Yeah,
I
hopefully
think
that
that
helps.
makes sense. I think we have time for one more question. This one is from Mateeb. He's asking, what if we have multiple opportunities that align with the strategy? Then what's the best way then?
Yeah, so if you've got multiple, that's also fine. You'll still need to prioritize. The thing that I'm getting at is like the number of opportunities that can align to your strategy is always going to be less than the number of opportunities you'll have if you don't have a strategy. Because if you don't have that strategy, you're going to have like 20 or 50 or 100. But if you do have the strategy, suddenly you can start to discard some of them. Let's say that you are really unlucky and you still ended up with like 15 opportunities that align to your strategy. Then you need to prioritize that. What I would be looking for is how can we do, like, create outcomes or those milestones off the back of it, whether that's OKRs or not, before we start to talk about those opportunities. So we got 20 opportunities. Okay, but based on our strategy, what would we do first? And then how do I model that into an outcome? Like, what milestone do I think we should see first that would indicate that we're realizing our strategy and we're heading in the right direction? And then from there, I'll then look at the 20 odd or whatever, 15, 20 opportunities, and I'll see what still aligns to that outcome. Hopefully you can discard a few more. Let's say you're really unlucky again and you're down to 10. If you're down to 10, then I'll start to employ a prioritization framework. That's why I said at the beginning, I mentioned spreadsheet prioritization. I gave it a bad rap, but I'm not against it. I'm not against it when we use it in the right setting. So if you end up all the way down to, we've got 10 opportunities that align to this outcome, that align to our strategy, and we're trying to work out what goes first, then start to employ prioritization frameworks. Um, you can use any, but use something that's going to help you prioritize. Some frameworks are better than others. That's probably a whole nother conversation in of itself, but whatever's going to help you come to a decision. The one, just to give you a bit of a steer, the frameworks that I personally think are better than others are ones that start to look for data as inputs, right? So when you start to actually rationalize, this is more important than this because I've got good evidence to support that this is, yeah, a great idea. I also like ones that take confidence into account.
Mm, that makes sense. I think aligning your strategy makes prioritizing very easy. And how you've linked all of these aspects, I think that's very insightful. And I think we're on time. So, and any last words before I take it off?
And my only last word would be, feel free to reach out and connect if you do have any more questions or anything. Like, I'm always more than happy to answer, and I try my best to give as much as possible and to do these things and to answer anyone who genuinely reaches out to me with a genuine question for help. I will always endeavor to reply to them. Some weeks that gets a little crazy for me, um, but I become slow to reply. But I will always endeavor to reply to somebody who genuinely wants help. So yeah, so feel free to do that is all I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you so much, Anne, for your time. It was a very insightful session. And to everybody that's watching us, do join our Slack community. We are a bunch of product managers helping each other out, posting different events and things that you can read up on. You can also visit our website to and our LinkedIn page to see what we are doing other than Sochology Eduseries. Thank you. This was Asinzia with Ant, and take care and until next time.
Thank you.